Welcome to our second class or our second part of our class, which we began on genetics. So in this class now, under genetics, we'll be looking at some terms. So genetics, sorry. So we are going to be looking at genetics. Yeah, so in this part of the video, we are going to be covering the languages which you need to understand. Language of genetics. So this is the most, I repeat, this is the most part which is very important on genetics. As I start explaining, you will even start seeing some of the questions which you have already seen in the past papers. So make sure you pay particular attention. So what is the first term which you come across under genetics? So the first term which you come across is a chromosome. So what is a chromosome? So this is the first revision. Our aim is to do what? To simplify things for you. So be sure to subscribe and follow for more. So whenever we're talking about the chromosome, in simple terms, you just say a chromosome carries what? Inherited information. So this is what carries now what? The inherited information. So information like the eye color, how the person will look, the height, all those things are on a chromosome. Yeah. Then our next word or our next language is what is known as a gene. So what does a gene mean? So a gene in simple terms is just a portion of DNA controlling one particular characteristics. So we said that this is the portion of the DNA controlling one particular characteristic. Yeah. Then, whenever we're talking about the gene, it's a portion of DNA controlling one particular characteristics. What do we mean? So this is the part now which controls the eye color, blood group, even the body mass. If the person will be fat, thin, just like that. So that portion that controls that is known as a gene. But in some cases, we can have a gene like in what? Continuous variation. A gene is controlling a lot of characteristics. That is known as polygenic. So we say that polygenic is when a gene is controlling a lot of characteristics. A gene is controlling more than one characteristic. Yeah, so this is what you need to understand. A gene is just a portion of DNA controlling a particular characteristic. It can be height, body mass, eye color, so forth and so on. Then our next term which you need to understand is an allele. So what do we mean when we say an allele? Some people may say an allele, but it is an allele. So an allele, this is just an alternative form of a gene. So this is an alternative form of a gene. So what do we mean when we say an alternative form? So this is the other form which represents a gene. But here there is a twist. This one, an allele, you will always have 2 or more alleles. Why? Because you have 2 parents. So alleles are a contribution from both parents. You can get 1 allele from your mother, 1 allele from your father. That's why we are saying that this is an alternative form, because a gene is found on what? On the DNA. Then when we say an alternative form, meaning there should be a mother and a father to provide an alternative. Yeah, so an example which we can say this is an alternative form of a gene is blood group. So when we are talking about blood group, this is a gene. We have a gene which encodes for blood group. But when we come to alleles, we can have an allele which codes for blood group A, an allele which codes for blood group B, and an allele which codes for blood group O. So these 3 are alternative forms of what? Of blood group. That is the meaning of an allele. Yeah, so the next thing is genotype and phenotype. So these 2 words, I'll take them together because we have genotype and we also have phenotype. So what do we mean when we are talking about genotype and we are also talking about a phenotype? So whenever we're talking about a genotype, this is just now the combination of these alleles. So if you are following me carefully, you are seeing how the information is adding on top of each other. Even if you are studying, you never forget. We started with a chromosome which carries inherited information. Then on the chromosome, we have what? A gene which controls a particular characteristics. Then we have an alternative form of a gene which is an allele which controls other forms of what? A gene. Then next we also have what? A genotype, which, so we have also a genotype now, which is a combination of alleles. So when you combine these alleles, you form what is known as a genotype. In other words, the genetic makeup of an organism, what an organism contains. So when you're talking about a genotype, we say that this is just a combination of alleles. Yeah. So when you combine alleles, what we can have is, for example, you can have is like this. Because we say that alleles always move together. One from the parent, one from the father, one from the mother. So whenever you see this, just remember that this is the genotype. Then, when we are talking about the phenotype now, this is the physical characteristics. So, what do we mean when we say these are the physical characteristics? So whenever we're talking about the physical characteristics, we are saying that these are the features which you will see when you look at someone. Of course, if we look at someone, we can see that, okay, this someone is short, this someone is tall, this someone is dark, this someone is what? Light colored. Those physical characteristics are what are known as phenotype, how someone looks. So you need to know that. Then there are also two terms which we'll talk about together. So the terms are, we have dominant and we also have recessive. So again, these two terms go hand in hand together. So what do we mean when we say dominant? So dominant and recessive, they basically apply to alleles. So whenever we're talking about dominant and recessive, whatever should come into your mind are alleles. So when we have a dominant allele, I repeat, when you have a dominant allele, that allele gets expressed masking the other. We say that alleles always move in pairs. So if we have a dominant allele, it will get expressed and mask the other. The other. Meaning a dominant allele will always be expressed in a capital letter. So it can either be capital A, capital B, capital C, capital T, capital X. So it will just depend on the letter you have been given. Just remember that a dominant allele is always expressed in capital letter, and it is the one that will be expressed. Then next we are going to look at recessive. So if we know that dominant is getting expressed and the other one is being masked, so meaning the recessive is the other allele which is being masked. So a recessive allele does not get expressed. So this recessive allele gets masked and overshadowed. Yeah, so this is always, we say that this is represented in capital letters. Then a recessive allele always you express it in small letters. So these things I'm telling you, remember them, because when you start drawing the genetic diagrams, this is where you need to apply what I'm telling you here. So once you understand the language of genetics, I guarantee you no question on genetics will be hard for you, because you just apply what we are learning here. That's why I'm taking time to explain the terms. So the final two terms or the final three terms which we are going to look at are, we have what is known as condominance, we have what is known as heterozygous, Then we also have what is known as the homozygous. So these are the three final terms which you need to understand whenever you are talking about genetics. So what does condominance mean? So whenever you hear the word condominance, just remember that since we have a dominant, we also have a recessive. Then when we have a condominance, this is where now different alleles are expressed in the phenotype. So under condominance, no allele get masked. So here different alleles are expressed without masking the other. So different alleles are expressed without masking the other. So meaning if they are expressed in the phenotype without masking each other, meaning they will be both be in what? Capital letters. So here remember we're talking about different, not the same. So it can either be B, let's take for blood group. So it can either be AB, we have Toto, yeah, just like that. So whenever you have these are known as condominants. You have different alleles which are expressed in the same phenotype. Then when we talk about heterozygous, when we are talking about heterozygous, this is where you have different alleles. So heterozygous and condominants are different. So here when you have heterozygous, we are saying we have different alleles. Yeah. So here, what we mean when we have different alleles, we can have either AA or A, B, or yeah, we will use the two examples. So we can have AA or AB. So what do I mean? So here we can see that we have both a dominant allele and a recessive allele. Or we can have both dominant alleles together. But the key here, they must be different. Or we can have recessive alleles. But the key idea is they should be different from each other. Then the next thing we are going to talk about is homozygous. So whenever we're talking about homozygous, this is just the opposite of heterozygous. Whenever we're talking about homozygous, this is the same alleles now. So an organism has the same alleles. So it can either be allele for blood group, alleles for height, alleles for eye color. So in our case, here the alleles should be always the same. It doesn't matter if they are in small letters, capital letters. So these are the terms which you need to know under genetics. Then one final important thing which you need to understand on heterozygous and homozygous is that organisms which are homozygous, organisms which have the same alleles, are known as the pure breed. So whenever you hear the word pure breed in your question, just remember that these are homozygous organisms and they have the same alleles. Yeah, so now how can you know that, okay, I'm supposed to use a small letter or a capital letter? So they will give you in the question. I've talked about dominant and recessive. They can say this organism is the homozygous recessive. Homozygous recessive, you pick the small letter. Heterozygous recessive, you pick what? The small letter. Homozygous dominant, you pick the capital letter. Just like that. So that's why I've taught you this language of genetics. Once you understand this, no question will be hard for you. Then the last part is the heterozygous. So organisms that have different alleles, they are known as the hybrid. So whenever you hear the word hybrid and purebred, this means heterozygous and homozygous respectively. So these are the terms which you need to understand. Yeah. So there is a final part before we start looking at the questions which you need to also pay particular attention. So the final part, I'll just summarize it in 2 minutes. So these I've taught you here. You need to revise before we start solving what? The genetic diagram, because everything I'll be getting from here. These are the notes for you. Okay, so to talk about the last part in less than 2 minutes. So genetics has also 2 parts, which I will talk about only one part. So it has a part where I will talk about the sex linkage, and it has the part for blood inherited. So when we are talking about sex linkage, this is when a what? When we're talking about sex linkage, this is when a gene is present on what? On a chromosome. It can either be X chromosome or Y chromosome. So, in short, these sex linkage disorders or diseases, they only affect one type of gender. And we all know that men can never be carriers and women are always carriers. So those characteristics, those are what are explained under sex linkage. How someone can carry a disease and give someone without them having it. Then how can someone have a what? An albino if they are both what? The same. So those things are what are on sex linkage. And on sex linkage, we have 2 diseases which we need to look at. So the first disease which come under sex linkage is hemophilia. So what is hemophilia? So when you're talking about hemophilia, this is just a disease where human beings bleed for longer period than normal. So we know that when someone injured themselves, the blood should stop coming out within 1 to 2 minutes. But in hemophilia, whenever you injure yourself, blood does not stop coming because you have poor clotting factor. So this disease is inherited. You get this disease from your parents. Then, how can you get this disease? So this disease is what? First we say that hemophilia is when human beings bleed for longer period. And this disease is what? Recessive. When we say it is recessive. So what do we mean when we say the disease is recessive? So when we say the disease is recessive, meaning for someone to have this disease, they should have two recessive alleles like these. So whenever you see these two alleles, this basically represents someone having what? Hemophilia, because it is recessive. And when someone has a dominant allele for hemophilia, they are normal. So normal is dominant. We say that dominant is represented by H. So you can have either like this or like this. So whenever we have an allele for hemophilia looking like this, meaning this one is normal. So there are two types of normal. We have the first one, which is normal but cardia, meaning she is normal but she has the disease, she can transmit it. Then when you have this is just normal. So this is the first disease. Then another disease is what is known as lead-green blindness. So what do you mean when you say lead-green color blindness? So this is a type of disease where you won't be able to distinguish between lead and green. And this disease is also what? Recessive. Meaning you only get the disease if you have two small letters. If you have any capital letter, meaning that person is normal or is normal but a carrier. And one more thing, when we're looking at sex linkage has to do with the gender or the sex of the baby. So when we have XX, it means we have female. When we have XY, it means we have male. So whenever you are looking at questions that deal with sex linked, you have to remember that whenever you have XX, it means female. Whenever you have XY, it means male. So sex linked, I'll explain it better in our part 3 videos on genetics, where now we are going to be looking at the question which came in 2025 on genetics.